But I think the priority is vaccinating the vulnerable, the elderly first.
But you would vaccinate your children, but you would rather see the most vulnerable older people vaccinated first. Correct. Tough decisions for parents. I mean, it's very confusing, and you do this for a living, right? I mean, there's so much mixed information. I mean, even mainstream information, never mind all the fringe ridiculous. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. A lot of information in this podcast from two well-respected vaccine experts, and they don't exactly agree. But the focus is for parents, and do you or don't you vaccinate your kids from COVID-19? In the US and Israel and elsewhere, decisions were made months ago to vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds. But here in the UK, a vaccine advisory panel has suggested the benefits only marginally outweigh risks and advised against vaccinating under 16s. On this backstory, we hear from a British virologist who supports the decision and an Australian epidemiologist who disagrees. So we let you decide, but there is plenty of good information for you on the virus and what's ahead of us. Joining me now from the University of East Anglia is Paul Hunter. And Paul has two disciplines. Not only is he a professor of medicine, but he is a virologist and an epidemiologist. So he looks at COVID, Paul, in a few different ways, in a few different angles, right?
Indeed, yeah.
How do the two disciplines help you kind of break it down when you're...
When you're thinking about any of these viruses and infections, having an understanding both of the biology of the infection and how it causes disease, and importantly as well for COVID, how people's immunity to the virus develops and how long that lasts, plays well into the how much about what we know about how the disease spreads in populations. And particularly in relation to COVID, the issue is always going to be around balancing the duration of immunity against the infectiousness and the ways that the virus spreads. So both of those disciplines have sort of helped me try to at least get some understanding of COVID and how it's spreading and how it's likely to develop.
It's all new science in a way because it's a new virus. I mean, in that sense, because we don't, the science is applied in a traditional way to viruses, but I mean, this virus is something new and people around the world are trying to compress what could take years to study it into a very short.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's not as new as all that because we have experienced very similar viruses in the past, although not in the recent past. And so we do know a lot about the other coronaviruses that are endemic in human society. And I think one of the things that we haven't done well as a scientific community is actually try and learn the lessons from these other coronaviruses. And there's some very important lessons that we could learn from other coronaviruses. The first is that actually these coronaviruses are endemic. They spread widely in human societies. Typically, they cause infections every 3 to 6 years. So infection doesn't give lifelong immunity. And we're learning that about COVID.
Infection doesn't give life-on immunity.
Lifelong immunity.
Lifelong.
So if you get an infection, and then even 12 months later, get another infection with exactly the same virus, you're not going to get herd immunity. And I think that's been obvious to most virologists for some time. Virologists who work in this area, certainly. I mean, Nature did...
Do you think that surprised people who were coming up with the vaccines and administering and government decisions, that they thought that they would have a free pass once they got that initial rollout of vaccines?
I think so, but I think it was never going to happen. And I think people who work on coronaviruses. Nature magazine did a survey of the top 100 or so coronavirus experts around the world on what they saw the way forward. And I wouldn't put myself into the top in that regard, but the large majority of them felt that the virus wasn't going away. It was going to be here forever, and that it would become endemic. And by definition, therefore, we would never achieve herd immunity. But we still hear people talking about the need to vaccinate to achieve herd immunity. And typically, the people who are still talking about herd immunity aren't people who've worked in infectious disease epidemiology before COVID. And I think that's been trying to get that message through has been quite difficult.
What else? What's the other? Before I turn to the area that I really want to talk about, and that's kids and vaccines. What else do you think we should have learned?
I think the other really big thing is that vaccines don't stop infection. They reduce the risk of infection quite a bit, maybe by as much as 50-60%. But not as well against Delta variant as against Alpha variant, and not as well against Alpha as the original strain either. But what they do, and equally well for the variants, is reduce the risk of severe disease. So ultimately, we're going to see many infections over coming years, but much fewer cases of severe disease, many fewer deaths, many fewer hospitalizations than we're seeing at the moment. And that's because immunity to severe disease lasts a lot longer. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. It's to do with T cells and memory B cells, but also as well because the vaccines seem to work just as well against the different variants against severe disease.
All right, so I have the vaccine. Mm-hmm. I get COVID.
Yeah.
Does my natural immunity, not from the vaccine, prevents severe illness, hopefully?
Yeah.
But do my natural immunity, T cells and all of that, do they still act in a natural way so that the next time I encounter this, I should be stronger?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's not absolute. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence now that actually the people with the best immunity, walking around with the best levels of immunity at the moment, are people who've had the vaccine and then actually got COVID soon afterwards. And probably as well the other way around, people who've had COVID and then were vaccinated. And that seems to give the best immunity.
Do you in general support vaccines?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, without vaccines, we would be seeing many more deaths globally than we've seen at the moment. Our health services would have collapsed under the strain, and we would be in a dreadful situation now without vaccines.
Is your head spinning as much as mine at the disinformation that's on the internet and the fear that has been spread through some of this, ridiculous anti-vaccine discussion? And I don't want to take anything away from those people because they're trying to get to truth and they're trying to understand if something's being hidden from them, and fair enough. But nevertheless, the conversation's taken a right-hand turn.
Yeah, I mean, it is. There has been just so much misinformation around this pandemic. But that's not new. There was a lot of misinformation circulating when we had the Spanish flu, almost, just over 100 years ago. So misinformation is not new, and it's not just a product of the social media, although social media has made the situation worse.
It's a hell of an echo chamber, especially if it's spreading fake news.
Yeah, absolutely. And it must be said that a lot of the misinformation that's circulating is very difficult sometimes to disentangle from truth. And people on both sides of the debate are often sharing information that isn't true. pro-lockdown or anti-lockdown, they're often circulating information and giving, which isn't actually based in scientifically credible facts. And so, trying to get a right balance between what we really know compared to what people say we know on both sides of the debate has been quite difficult at times.
There is some
people on both sides hate you. The debate hate you.
There is some children laughing and yelling, and that's coming in the window, but that's a perfect bridge to where we're going. And because in that playground, just over my shoulder, there are a lot of parents sitting there scratching their heads, and with all good intention saying, do they vaccinate children? Do they vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds, especially? Because that is a debate right now in the United Kingdom, although they've gone ahead with vaccinations in the United States and in Israel and elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think it's not a straightforward and easy decision to make. I think my view is pretty much in line with what JCVI said.
That is an advisory board of professionals.
Yeah, that's the Joint Committee on Vaccinations and Immunisations, who have on their board the UK's leading experts on vaccines, not just COVID vaccines, but vaccines generally, and also have considerable experience at weighing up the pros and cons in favour of individual vaccines.
And they've essentially, just to give people the background on it, they came out in the last week. It caused a huge stir by saying they don't feel that the benefits outweigh the risks of vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds. Is that a fair summation?
They said that any benefit was marginal.
Marginal.
Yeah.
So what does that all that mean?
Well, it means that it was pretty much, the benefits in their assessment pretty much equal the disadvantages. So the benefits of vaccine, instead of in terms of protecting against COVID, equal are only marginally greater than the possible harms from vaccination in this age group.
Because there is some risk in taking the vaccine,
absolutely,
such as
a disease called myocarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart, which when you have it, it can be very scary, chest pain, palpitations, and it can be very frightening. Ultimately, it doesn't lead to your death, and most people seem to have made a pretty rapid recovery, although there is still some uncertainty about whether that could lead to some longer-term adverse consequences, which is, I think, one of the things that made our vaccination committee a bit nervous.
So that makes me nervous as a parent, but at the same time, I've heard that you can also get that condition from COVID. Can you not? And
yes. If you have COVID, then you are much more likely to get myocarditis.
Like 6 times more likely, somebody said.
Diseases. Yes, but the difficulty is that the risks associated with COVID increase as you get older. So that, if you're in your mid-60s, you are far more likely to suffer severe consequences from COVID than a teenager.
So a 12 to 15-year-old, the chances are pretty small that they're going to
absolutely
develop severe illness.
The risks of side effects from the vaccine seem to be higher in children, in younger people, than they are in older people.
Okay, so a lot of your professional colleagues, epidemiologists, for instance, that I know and I've interviewed, have said, but this committee didn't take into account long COVID and some of the.
Well, we don't know that. They haven't said what they what they haven't released their thinking on this. And long COVID is real, but at the moment it's still very difficult. We still don't know exactly how big a contribution to disease burden it would be, and so it is. it's another part of the uncertainty, really. And and
so what was I smart to get my 17-year-old a vaccine?
I think so. The other issue actually with children is that many children have actually already had COVID and have recovered. And 17-year-olds, the majority of 17-year-olds would have already had COVID and recovered.
Even though as a parent, I may not know that my child had.
Yeah, because the chances of them getting asymptomatic infection, many more younger adults and children have very mild illness with COVID, and many of them have totally no symptoms at all. And so you won't know. The only reason why we know this is people have been doing antibody testing, and we know in about 2/3 of the end of July, about 2/3 of 17-year-olds had antibodies. So 2/3 definitely had COVID, but we also know that maybe as many as a quarter of people who get COVID don't develop antibodies. So
the number could be even higher.
Pardon?
So the number could be even higher.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost certainly higher than that. And but if your son has had COVID and has been vaccinated, then he will have pretty strong immunity.
Okay. I mean, I personally, based on what I've read about vaccines, feel that the risk is quite low, the benefit is quite high. We deliberated about it a long time and thought about it. But now with this age bracket of 12 to 15-year-olds, listening to you, I probably wouldn't get the vaccine. But at the same time, Britain is likely to press ahead with this. Now, the government is not going to necessarily take the advice from that committee, and they are likely to start administering vaccines to children in schools, and they will make that decision this Friday.
Yeah, I mean, and that's their decision to make, because it is a fairly fine decision. And you're quite right, there are a lot of people who thought the decision of the vaccination committee was wrong. But I have a considerable faith in the people on the vaccination committee. And remember, the last time a lot of people were saying, were really criticizing JCVI, was over the gap between vaccines, first and second dose. And actually, the Americans thought we were stupid. Many of the Europeans thought we were stupid. And actually, all the evidence now is that there's probably saved thousands of lives in the UK, and it was absolutely the right decision.
Because it was a longer gap.
Yes, up to 12 weeks. And the evidence is that even with Pfizer vaccine, if you extend the gap, you get a better antibody response that lasts longer. So ultimately, I think we're in a much better position now than we would have been if we'd still given the 3-week gap. So they got it right.
Would you give your 12 to 15-year-old a vaccine? And if the government's going to recommend it, will you be shaking your head saying that's a mistake, or will you say, you're on the
it's I don't know. I mean, it is.
You have to. You got to make a decision,
right? If it was me, I would not be advising rolling out vaccines to 12 to 15-year-olds. I would follow the JCVI decision. But I'm not. If the government decides to go ahead with it, I wouldn't lose faith with the government over that, I think.
But it'll be left up to the parent, and the parents.
Absolutely, yes.
The parents will have to decide, and thus the great consternation, and I mean, it's really smoke and mirrors and very foggy as a parent right now whether you go ahead with a vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the debate that's gone on in the last few weeks around this has not made it easier for parents, and if anything, has made it more difficult for parents, absolutely. But I do think that based on the criteria that it uses to make these decisions, that the JCVI decision was the correct one. But if the government goes ahead with the vaccine, then and leaves it to parents to decide, then that's that'll be where we are. And
why wouldn't the government just say? Why wouldn't
Pardon?
the government just say let's wait? Let's wait. Is it because
I don't know. I think
they're worried about the spread of COVID, and therefore
I think that's the thing that's driving them. But actually, as a number of infectious disease modelers have pointed out, that maybe vaccinating children probably won't have that much of an impact on the spread of COVID, on reducing the spread of COVID either. So it's not a foregone conclusion that vaccinating children will make all the difference to our ability to control COVID over the course of the next few months.
And what do you say to all those people that say that the schools are really the biggest transmission area?
Well, we don't actually know that.
Why?
We do know that schools being open or closed last spring 2020, was probably the single biggest thing that made the difference to the spread of COVID. We found that when we analysed European data, as other groups have found that as well, looking at European and more wider data, that school closures last April, May, June had the biggest impact on controlling the first wave. By the second wave, schools being open and closed had a much less impact on the transmission than they did in the first wave. Now, we don't know why that is, but that was a paper out about a month or so ago by a group from Oxford who found that. And looking at more recent data ourselves, we found it quite difficult to really show a strong impact of schools being open or closed on transmission in the UK. Now, if schools, there's still debate as to whether or not how schools being open or closed impacts on the epidemic, or how it impacted on the epidemic. Some think it's because of spread within schools, and others think it might be primarily to do with the fact that when your children are in school, you're meeting other adults far more frequently. You're meeting friends for a coffee. You're going to work in a way that when schools are closed, you've got to be at home to look after your kid. And
interesting.
And probably both are happening. I'm quite convinced that last November, there was certainly spread within schools of the Alpha variant that was probably primarily spreading in that age group. But more recently, I think the evidence is on the role of schools is more uncertain than it was last year. And we've seen in Scotland, where Scotland is going through quite a surge of or has been going through quite a surge of infections, that a number of people have stated is because schools were open. And actually, that surge started before schools went back. And it takes about once you've done something to control COVID, it takes about 10 days for it to appear in the statistics. It takes 5 days to incubation period, a day or so to decide you want to go and have a test as you become ill, and then a day or so for the test to be done and then be reported. And actually, when you look at the time when the impact of schools would be being seen in the statistics, the rate of increase was slowing dramatically. And so at the moment, it's really uncertain how much schools going back will impact. We'll know in not this week, but probably towards the end of next week, we'll have a much better idea about England and whether that's what the impact of schools going back will have been. But we won't know for about another week and a half for that.
Last question. What concerns you the most as you cast your eyes forward and you think about this endemic virus?
Right, yeah. I think the fact that we're going to have an endemic infection with the virus isn't as scary as it first sounds, because by and large, once it's endemic and we've been vaccinated and we've maybe experienced an infection or two, we won't be getting the severity of disease that we're seeing. So, and that we saw that the virus that caused the last major pandemic in 1890 is still with us. It still circulates. We get it infected with it about every 3 to 6 years. And most of the time it's asymptomatic, or at worst it causes a common cold. I think the concern at the moment is how we get from here to there, and whether or not we will start seeing waning severity, waning effectiveness of vaccine or immunity against severe disease in the meantime. And so if in 10 years' time, we probably will have had at least a couple of infections with COVID by then, and we might have, even if we've been vaccinated now, and chances are it'll be very mild. But getting from here to there is going to be tricky. And I think if we start seeing falling protection against severe disease over the course of the next year or so, then certainly some of what we've gained with the vaccination program could start to be being lost. There's no sign of that at the moment, but it is the thing that I think does concern me. I'm not so worried about new variants coming along anymore, because I think the Delta variant probably is going to be the best fit for humanity and therefore the most infectious. But there will be immune resistant or escape variants becoming, as there is for the other human coronaviruses. They're throwing up escape variants quite regularly, and we'll see that undoubtedly with COVID.
I just don't know why you would have more severe illness if you don't have more severe mutations. So why would the...
Well, because I mean, if you sort of and this what I'm saying actually predates COVID. This sort of these views predate COVID, and when a virus jumps host, it initially isn't a very good fit for the host. And you can sort of think about this as a key and a lock, with the virus being the key and us being the lock. So the initial virus isn't a good fit, so it's not necessarily that infectious. And over the course of a number of months, the virus mutates and develops, and those mutations that are a better fit for the lock win out. And then what happens is that once you've got the best fit, and by the fit, we're talking about the fit for the cellular receptors for the virus, then evolution tends to slow dramatically. And
because the virus is thriving and it doesn't.
Yeah, the virus, it's got the best fit. It's as infectious as it's going to ever be, because that's the best it can get.
Yes.
And I think Delta probably is that point. And I'm not certain, but I think I think all the evidence is pointing that way. And And so once you've achieved that, further mutations aren't going to make the virus more infectious or necessarily more severe.
Mm-hmm.
What they do is make the virus less controlled by prior immunity, these escape mutations, whether the immunity comes from vaccine or natural infection. But what we're seeing with the existing viruses or the existing vaccines is that even when they are not as good at stopping infection, they're still really good at reducing the risk of severe disease. And so ultimately, yes, we're going to see these escape mutations coming along quite regularly. But hopefully we'll keep up to date with them and we will be able to deal with them, and we still won't return to the severity of disease that we've seen up until now. But that's based on probably one of the more useful papers for that was written, I think it was about 2018, it was published, that looked at this and it sort of on the evidence for evolution of viruses after jumping host.
Paul Hunter with East Anglia University. Great to talk to you, and people should listen to mainstream science.
Absolutely.
Not all of it's going to agree with one another, but that's how you get balance, and that's how you stay informed, right? And
absolutely, yeah.
You don't go off into these rabbit hole chat rooms where you're listening to the paranoid run wild. I mean, you really, to make sensible decisions, you have to listen to sensible people, and you don't really have any skin in the game. You're not pushing one thing or another. I mean, you're serving the public.
No, indeed, and it is. Yeah, it is. We will get there. I think we will, in 2 years' time, we'll know it all. We'll know who was right.
Well, hopefully you'll talk to us again before then and now. And thank you so much, Paul.
Okay, lovely to talk to you. Take care.
Good to talk to you. All right, Archie Clements is somebody who I've talked to a number of times over the last year and a half since the pandemic started. He's in Australia. He is a professor. He is a pro-vice chancellor at the Faculty of Health Sciences at Curtin University. Hi, Professor Clements.
Hi, Dana. How are you doing?
We're in this deep debate around the world about vaccines for kids. And I want to get you there and talk to you about it. But first of all, Australia really led the world in a lot of different ways in the pandemic in terms of, this approach to zero COVID, close the border, shut the aircraft down. We can eliminate it within Australia and get back to normal. And all of that seems to be failing as we speak.
I think it's a bit of an overstatement to say that it's failing.
All right. I've been guilty of that before. Set me straight.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we have an outbreak happening predominantly in Sydney, but also spreading its tentacles out to Canberra and Melbourne. So the major cities on our eastern seaboard. But we've got to put that in perspective. I mean, the largest, the case numbers at the moment are between 1 and 2,000 cases per day, and in the grand scheme of things, that's still a relatively small outbreak compared to what we've seen, in the Northern Hemisphere. And the public health measures that we've used throughout the pandemic are being applied in those states, and we are seeing, we're not seeing exponential growth in case numbers. I think what's probably different at the moment is the messaging that we're getting from the government, that they're kind of preparing people for living with COVID, and that's different messaging to what we've had in the past. But I don't think fundamentally things have changed.
Well, that's because they couldn't eliminate it, right? And whereas other societies kind of said, we're going to have to live with it, Australia, New Zealand, other countries said, let's close the borders and we can have very close to zero COVID. And it looks now like that is I don't want to say failed experiment, because the numbers of people who died are so much lower than other nations. And that, I guess, by itself is a victory.
Absolutely. It's definitely not a failed experiment. I mean, the Australian approach has protected our communities from the devastation we've seen around the world. Large numbers of people dying, intensive care wards being overwhelmed, hospitals running out of ventilators, not having enough staff. None of that's happened in Australia. Even now, when we're having, from our perspective, a relatively large outbreak, but in the global perspective, a relatively small outbreak.
But the price is high economically.
Yes, it is. But, Australia, we did experience a brief recession, but, economically, the country's done quite well through the pandemic. The state that I live in, Western Australia, its economy, which is, of course, driven a lot by our mining and oil and gas, has been able to continue despite the border closures. So we have the kind of economy that is able to motor along, certainly in the West Coast, whilst the borders are closed.
I would say that politicians generally are not known for their backbone, but they are pretty good at reading winds of change. So you have the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison saying, it's like the movie The Croods, he says, referring to this 2013 movie about a prehistoric family that's forced to leave their home. People want to stay in the cave, he says. We can't stay in the cave and we've got to get out of it safely. In other words, let's get on with it. We have to reopen and we have to live with it.
Yeah, I think his language is probably a little patronising to the Australian people. I think the Australian people are pretty well informed. Of course, there's anxiety about letting COVID into the community. I think there's widespread recognition that the only way that Australia is going to get out of this is to get high vaccine coverage. And unfortunately, we're kind of at the end of the world. So, things have taken off a bit slower here than elsewhere.
What is it like about? It's the high 30% now, close to 40%.
Depending on how you define it, but it's the high 30% if you look at the eligible population, which is people over 16. So it is a bit slow, but ramping up very quickly at the moment. I don't think you're seeing the same level of vaccine hesitancy, for example, that you're seeing elsewhere in the world. I'm confident that we will get to the national target of 80%, and I'm not opposed to the notion that we will need to start opening up, or at least reducing our restrictions when we do get to that threshold. I think that's quite reasonable, but there is a piece of work to do to convince the Australian public that letting COVID into the community is a safe strategy.
So what's it like in your community right now? I mean, I know that these are not scientific questions I'm asking you, but when you go out into the street, can you go to a coffee shop? Can you?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, so in Western Australia, we've hermetically sealed ourselves off from the rest of the world, including the east coast of Australia. So, life here is pretty much as normal. The only thing we have to do at the moment is we have to register when we go into a premises, either using an electronic app or physically signing. Other than that, life is pretty much as normal.
So that's the track and trace process, but you cannot travel between cities very easily.
We can't travel from Western Australia. Well, we can travel from Western Australia out. We can't get back in again. And people can't come into Western Australia from the East Coast at the moment. So
coming back to the politics of it, do people now increasingly see that as extreme and they want to see those barriers dropped?
Look, I think there are different views in the public. I think there's a tendency for the Commonwealth government and some of the state premiers who are from the conservative side of politics to push opening up quicker. They are, as I say, the rhetoric is starting to change. They're now talking about Australians living with COVID in the community. But then you've got other state premiers like the ones in Western Australia and Queensland who have been very successful in keeping COVID out, absolutely holding the line when it comes to our elimination strategy. They don't call it an elimination strategy, but in effect, that's what it is, and keeping our borders sealed. So I think we are starting, probably for the first time, seeing a divergence in Australia when it comes to state-based strategies. We've had a lot of consensus up till now. I think that's starting to erode. Perhaps not surprising. I mean, we have a federal system, as you do in the United States. Cooperation has been the way of operating up till now, but I think we are starting to see some divergence.
So are we at the point where people just say, okay, we're going to get it. let's at least have it after the at least have it after the vaccine. So get the vaccine rates up, and then just let it run hot like they have in other countries.
Well, no, not quite. I think the general public, particularly in places like WA, that has not experienced large-scale community outbreaks, I don't think people are in that mindset at all. I think they're thinking, keep our borders shut until the vaccine coverage is really high, and then we think about opening up. But as I say, the state, Gladys Berejiklian, who's the Premier of New South Wales, Scott Morrison, who's the Prime Minister, are definitely talking about people having to get used to the notion that we will have COVID in the community. But I don't think that that's where the mind is of most people in the community in Australia.
Where's your mind as a scientist, as an epidemiologist? Don't you feel now that coverage around the world is so small in terms of vaccinations? And now with the Delta variant that has shown, it's very robust, it's taken over the other variants, that inevitably this is a virus that we're going to have to live with. It's not going to go away. You're better to get it sooner than later, and with a vaccine, so you don't have severe illness. So maybe there's a couple of questions in there.
Yeah, look, it worries me that we have extreme inequality when it comes to vaccine access and rollout. So we have high vaccine coverage in a number of countries around the world, but we have other countries where there's very little vaccine being delivered, and we have different vaccines being delivered, and some of which I think are more effective than others. The Secretary General of the WHO said very clearly that no one's safe until everyone's safe.
Yeah,
and
well, I mean, he can keep saying that, but that just has not affected the policy of rolling out vaccines to poorer countries, has it?
Oh, I think it has. I mean, we have the COVAX facility, we have donations. I think it has. I think, but of course, it hasn't happened in the way that he would have liked, or to the scale that he would like. But had we not had that, then it would be the Wild West when it comes to vaccine distribution. So I think people probably understate how effective the WHO has been. But we do have a situation of extreme inequity. And that means that we're all at risk because we have, the virus being transmitted in communities without intervention, without control.
And that's going to go on for years. That's going to go on for years. That is not going to be solved in a year or two.
No, it won't, because at the current rate of distribution of vaccines, we won't be vaccinating the whole planet for at least the next 3 to 4 years.
Right. So so bring it back to Australia then. I can understand why people are saying, let's get on with this and open.
Yeah, I mean, it's risky because we don't know how long we're going to be protected for with vaccines. We don't know what the requirements will be around boosters. We don't know how that distribution will happen. Is it ethical for us to be talking about giving booster vaccinations and vaccinating children in rich Western nations when vulnerable people in other parts of the world haven't even received their first vaccination? So, governments, I think, really are very much focused on the domestic agenda, but it's not a sustainable strategy to do that.
Where are you on vaccinating children, and where is Australia now on vaccinating children, the 12 to 15-year-olds?
So I guess I'm in favour of it, because I think that we need to maximise vaccine coverage in the community in order to address transmission. So because 12 to 15-year-olds, children, in fact, can transmit the virus. Then they haven't been major contributors, but they can transmit the virus. And I think in order to protect everyone, we need to get maximum coverage. And therefore, I do think we need to be vaccinating children. So, but there's kind of two reasons why you have a vaccination program. One is to protect people from dying and getting sick. So that's, you get vaccinated to protect yourself from getting sick, but you also get vaccinated in order to protect other people. Mm-hmm. So the first priority is to stop people getting sick and dying. And that's why you need to focus initially on the vulnerable, particularly the older members of the population. We need to be doing that worldwide. The next phase is getting on top of transmission, and that's where you really need to sort of focus on younger people, because they can contribute to transmission and they can infect other people who are vulnerable. So, it's a matter of staging. And I think we need to get the first stage out of the way first before we really focus on children. That's my view.
I know you used to be based here in the UK and you watch what's happening here. You know that a scientific vaccination advisory panel has told the UK government that they do not recommend vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds because the reward is marginal compared to the risk, although the risk appears to be fairly minor as well. What do you think of that whole debate? And the fact is, the UK government's probably going to decide to vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds anyway.
Yeah. Well, I've got two children they're going to be 11 in October, and I'll be wanting them to get vaccinated when they turn 12. I think severe illness in children is very rare, and I think that's true in terms of what the panel in the UK is saying. But it does happen. We have had one person in Australia dying in their teens and a couple of people in their 20s. So it happens rarely, but it does happen. But importantly, children can transmit to other people who are vulnerable. So if we had unlimited supply of vaccine, then I'd be in favour of vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds. But I think the priority is vaccinating the vulnerable, the elderly first.
But you would vaccinate your children, but you would rather see the most vulnerable older people vaccinated first. Correct. Tough decisions for parents. I mean, it's very confusing. And you do this for a living, right? I mean, there's so much mixed information. I mean, even mainstream information, never mind all the fringe ridiculous about anti-vaccination groups, but just the mainstream media trying to troll through that information. I don't want to use the word troll, but sift through that information and try to come about with a responsible decision for your children's health. It's heavy lifting.
Oh yeah, and it's not even the mainstream media. It's actually scientific advice itself is changing, and it's complex, and that's understandable. People need to understand that this is a new pathogen, and we're learning about it as we go. These are new vaccines. We haven't had, for example, mRNA vaccines distributed at scale before. Mm-hmm. So everything's new. And of course, we're learning as we go. We're trying to apply knowledge of, other related epidemics, viruses as we go, then learning about this pathogen, learning what's different about it. Learning about the adverse events associated with vaccines that we hadn't anticipated, or I should say, hadn't been identified in small-scale clinical trials, but then became apparent when you rolled out into the population. So it's been a learning experience for the scientific community as much as it has been for anybody else, and therefore the messaging has changed over time, and people just need to understand that that's because this is new.
Here's a tough one. You believe that because most of the world is vulnerable and we should vaccinate the most vulnerable first before we start turning to 12 to 15-year-olds and other age groups, would you reject a vaccine for your kids knowing that most of the world doesn't have access to vaccines for the most vulnerable, people over 60, 65?
Now, that's a very good question.
But that's what it comes down to for governments as well. Do they vaccinate their own population, or do they leave a portion of that population vulnerable to do world service to third world countries that don't have vaccines?
Yeah, well, I think they should. I think that's what they should do. And they're not really vulnerable. I mean, so as I said, severe outcomes in children are pretty rare. So, yeah, I mean, my preference would be that they hold off on vaccinating children, including my children, and focus on donating vaccines and supporting, lower and middle income countries to roll out vaccines in their communities.
But it's not happening. It's not happening, is it?
It is happening. Yes, it is happening through the COVAX facility. It's just not happening.
No, but COVAX is contributing. But countries like the UK, like America, they are vaccinating children and all their age groups that they can.
Yeah, and also
maybe they have a responsibility to do so. They would argue that they do.
Well, but like I say, I mean, it's not a sustainable strategy because If you leave the virus circulating out there in low income countries, new variants will emerge. Some of those variants may actually be refractory to the effects of the vaccine, and you end up getting COVID back into your community and be back at square one. So actually, it's not a sustainable strategy. If there's ever a time for global cooperation and looking beyond the domestic agenda, it's during a pandemic, because not the least because that's the right thing to do, the ethical thing to do, but because it's actually the self-interested thing to do. You're not safe until everybody else is safe, and that's the critical thing about pandemics.
Professor Archie Clements with Curtin University. Professor, always great to talk to you, and I really appreciate your perspective.
You're very welcome.
And that's our backstory on COVID and kids and vaccines. I respect your decision to give your kids vaccines or not, but make sure you make that decision after listening to real experts, not fringe websites and right-wing media hosts who are pushing politics over health and peddling disinformation over common sense. Stay away from media which is not neutral and doesn't give both sides. If they have a political agenda, that's your first clue. You've tapped into voices which won't bring you closer to finding the truth. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory, and I'll talk to you again soon.